In this episode, there's a house in Indiana that would send shivers down some people's spines if they stepped inside, unaware of what lurked in the rooms. A house full of 140 snakes was a disaster waiting to happen. And that disaster struck 36-year-old Laura Hurst as she handled an 8-foot-long reticulated python. Hit like and subscribe. This is Fierce. In 2019, in Oxford, Indiana, there was a house that no one lived in on North Dan Patch Drive. But that's not to say that it was uninhabited. In fact, it had the most inhabitants in the entire block. It was home to 140 snakes. They were all different shapes, sizes, and species, and the majority of them were owned by Benton County Sheriff Don Munson. His enthusiasm for snakes had rubbed off on his daughter, and he agreed to take one of his snakes to her elementary school one day. The snake he chose to take was Simba, a beautiful reticulated python who was 13 feet or 4 meters long and weighed 45 pounds or 20 kilograms. The children were in awe of the large reptile and were eager to stroke its smooth, shiny skin. He was a hit with the school and the principal, and at the time, Don said he had 52 snakes in his garage. He was breeding them to sell. It wasn't long before their numbers grew. Don owned a house that was full of snakes, and he had purposefully kitted it out to hold his huge collection of reptiles. He lived in the house next door, which meant he was able to regularly check on them. He bred them for sale on the open market. But 20 of them weren't his. They belonged to another snake enthusiast. Her name was Laura Hurst. She was a 36-year-old mother of 2. Laura grew up on the family's cattle farm. She loved the outdoors. She loved riding motorcycles, spending weekends on the river, and most of all, rescuing and rehabilitating snakes. It was a passion of hers, and being able to house her pet snakes at Don Munson's property was an ideal arrangement. She lived just 20 minutes away and checked on them twice a week. Laura's friends were aware of her love for snakes, and once she brought one into work, much to the delight of her colleagues. The snake's house was a single-story building, a dark blue painted bungalow with a garage on one end. Inside, there were hundreds of cages and tanks for the snakes. The conditions they were kept in were in accordance with the law, but Don had never registered his snake breeding business with local authorities, and this could have proved illegal. No signs were in place to warn visitors of the snakes within the premises, and so nobody knew what was in there except for Don's family and Laura. That was until disaster struck. On Wednesday, October 30th, 2019, Laura, who worked as a harness engineering build technician, drove towards North Dan Patch Drive in the evening. She pulled into the concrete driveway and opened the front door. She inspected the tanks and cages and fed her snakes. Then she took out one of Don's snakes. It was a reticulated python, 8 feet or 2.5 meters in length. Carefully, she lifted the reptile out of its tank. Its tongue flicked in and out of its closed mouth. Its body was cool to the touch. The skin was beautifully patterned and silky smooth. Laura sat down with it as it crawled over her legs, inspecting the room they were in, its slender yet muscular body pulling it along the floor. Reticulated pythons are native to South and Southeast Asia. They are popular within the pet industry as they are relatively easy to keep in captivity. They can grow up to 20 feet or 6 meters long and weigh up to 165 pounds or 75 kilograms. In the wild, they typically feed on mammals such as rodents, primates, pigs, and deer. They are not venomous. Instead, they kill their prey by constriction. They are ambush predators, lying in wait for an unsuspecting animal to come along. Then they use their super-fast reactions to strike, capturing the animal in its jaws before wrapping its body around it and squeezing it to death. In Indonesia, they are becoming a problem, particularly for people living in rural communities. Due to the fragmentation of their habitats, largely from deforestation to make way for oil palm plantations, the reticulated pythons have to travel across farmland in search for food. Workers in the fields have been targeted recently, and their colleagues or families find them sometimes wrapped in the coils of the snakes, or sometimes, shockingly, inside the snake itself, once it has swallowed them whole. But despite the dangers these animals pose to humans, snake lovers the world over still handle them and enjoy doing so. Laura picked the huge python up off the floor and put it back in its tank. It was heavy. She lifted it up onto her shoulders and began walking back towards the open tank. But as she did so, the snake tightened its grip around her neck. Laura pulled at it slightly to loosen it, but the more she pulled, the more the snake tightened. It was incredibly strong, and Laura tried to move her head out from underneath it, but there was no room. Within a split second, the snake had coiled so tightly around Laura's neck that she couldn't free herself. She felt the pressure in her face rise as it squeezed tighter and tighter, its muscles constricting. Laura tried to twist its head, but she couldn't reach it. She clawed at its skin as the blood supply to her head was cut off from the rest of her body. The snake barely moved. Its unblinking eyes were fixed. Its shiny skin pooled around Laura's neck. She began to struggle to breathe. Her lips turned blue and her eyes bulged, and she knew she was in serious trouble. She couldn't scream. She couldn't reach her phone. Things were happening too fast, and within minutes, she felt herself become dizzy from lack of oxygen and blood supply to the brain. She knew she was about to pass out. Seconds later, she fell to the floor. The snake continued to asphyxiate her, even though she now lay motionless and unresponsive on the ground. Don looked out of his window that evening and noticed Laura's car in the driveway. He knew she usually checked the snakes on a Wednesday evening, and so he decided to pop over and see how she was doing. He opened the front door and called out to her. There was no reply. He walked through the menagerie and past the open tank. Then he stepped into the next room. There, lying on the floor, was Laura, and still wrapped around her neck was the 8-foot-long python. Don rushed to her side. The snake was wrapped loosely around Laura's neck, and so he pulled it off easily. He immediately called emergency services. When they arrived, they tried to revive Laura, but tragically, she was gone. Naturally, Don was in the firing line following Laura's death. What was he doing with so many snakes in his home? Did he have the necessary paperwork to legally house them all? It seems the licensing surrounding keeping reptiles in Indiana wasn't all that clear. The Indiana Department of Natural Resources doesn't regulate reticulated pythons because they are not a native species. They do, however, regulate venomous snakes and those that are considered endangered. But seeing as reticulated pythons are none of these, they do not require permits. Since 1978, there have been 18 known deaths by constricting snakes within the U.S. However, reptile enthusiasts claim that dogs do far more damage to people than snakes, causing serious injuries or deaths each year. It's only because an attack like Laura's is incredibly rare that it makes the headlines. Following the aftermath, town council members were keen to impose a new law on snakes in the state. It would ensure that people were made aware of who kept snakes and where they were kept for safety reasons and in case of an emergency. But Don could have been in more trouble if he was breeding the snakes to sell and hadn't registered the property as a business. None of these outcomes would bring back Laura, and it is unlikely they would have prevented this from happening in the first place. People with a passion for certain potentially dangerous animals know the risks they take. And, like with so many things, nobody ever believes it will happen to them. Until it does.